Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Bard Room. We are doing more dramaturgical work on Ibsen and a more academic look at his stuff and how he fits into the genre of modern drama. Um, and when I was in the undergrad that I did in theater, the modern drama basically had Shaw, had Wilde. Wilde was a little late, had Chekhov, Strindberg, Ibsen, and people like that. And I may have been dropping some playwrights, but I think those are the main players. But Eric is from South Oregon University in the theater department there. Read about your Fulbright. That was about 3 years ago.
Yeah, in
Yeah.
2013 or
Oh,
14.
13. Okay. And that was in Ireland, I believe.
In Ireland. Yeah, I
Yeah.
went to study to do studies on modern drama,
Okay.
kind of surrounding Eugene O'Neill, but
Right.
in a broader sense, an Irish drama.
Right. And then, right. So monodrama goes into the Eugene O'Neill era, little touches on Tennessee Williams, Arthur Miller, those. Okay. So as I always do with my wonderful guests, and Eric, we don't have all night, but I'd love to hear your resume. So if you could tell us, how you got into this. You can go from childhood if you like, or from high school on, and how it ended up. And I also throw in any attitudes you had or any experiences that were interesting during COVID, whether it be with teaching. On Zoom or anything like that, or having to cancel things and the theater, and we all know how that went. So go right ahead, Eric.
Hi. So I placed my own beginnings of theater when I was about 12 or 13, and I started being a counselor at a summer camp, or it was a day camp, and basically this day camp used drama to teach kids. It was a Jewish day camp, and we had people of all religions in it. But we taught Bible stories, and we taught moral lessons and things like that through very dramatic, very hands-on ways. And unbeknownst to me, some of my colleagues who were older than I was in college were studying psychology and education, all these different things, and they were using some of the contemporary exercises and theoretical approaches that later became known as children's theater or creative drama, actually, working with kids to educate them. So I frequently during the summer found myself with a cotton ball beard leading a bunch of 5-year-olds over Berkeley Creek on the Berkeley campus dressed in sheets, pretending that we were Moses and the children of Israel going, we built a dam on either side.
Right.
So we had a lot of fun with it. A lot of the stuff we did was exploratory, so kids could explore their own experiences through it. And so a lot of the stuff we did wouldn't be able to be done today because parents don't have the same kind of trust that they used to have.
Right.
In where they left their kids. So anyway, I started high school drama. I did it for my sophomore year. And for some reason, my group and I, we all wanted to go to study theater. I went to UCLA as a theater major and stayed there for 2 years. I did some self-produced stuff, very bad stuff. A friend of mine who was also a freshman wrote a play. I directed the play for a student production, and it was terrible. But I still went and found out, got critiqued by all the professors, that kind of thing. And then I transferred to Berkeley. I just didn't like the feel of UCLA, and I began to realize that UCLA reflected a professional actor's life, which is what I wanted to go into. And so I left. I decided that wasn't for me. Going from audition to audition, and not knowing where my next job was. I just didn't have the stamina for it. And I started studying kind of a pan theater program. I designed lights, I did some set work, I did some props work, and I also acted at UC Berkeley. So I got a really broad-based theatrical education there. And then I quit for a while. I did a couple of things. I did some community theater while I was working. And I finally realized that I needed to be a teacher, that when I was in front of kids, it was the same feeling for me that I had before a play opened, or when I could hear the audience in my ears, and that
Right.
same kind of fear and thrill ran through me. And so I went and got my teaching credential up in Oregon. That's when I moved to Oregon. And I taught for about 5 years. And then I decided that I really wanted to be more involved with theater. A high school teacher doesn't really they do theater, but it's not necessarily informed. And I certainly didn't feel competent to run an entire production. So I went back to school and got my PhD in theater at University of Oregon. Worked for a couple of years in a university in North Dakota, Dickinson State University. And then we didn't like North Dakota at all. So we moved to the Central Valley, and I picked up work at the local community college and ended up teaching in high school. And I got to Oregon because my wife and I went to school in Oregon. I knew Oregon, and I had been to Ashland many times, but that's kind of where my wife and I decided we wanted to retire eventually. And a job came up to run a new program, a graduate program for theater teachers. And that felt perfect to me because I had the academic credentials and I had the experience with theater teachers. And I was in fact teaching in a classroom at the time. So I came up and I think I took the program over, the Master of Arts in Teaching at Southern Oregon University. And I ran that for about 15 years. And right after my sabbatical in Ireland, I stopped. So I'm really an academic, but I teach theater from a theatrical standpoint in terms of analysis rather than an English standpoint, which is a very, very different thing. And the way I explain it to my students is, if you're teaching drama as in an English class, this text, that is the finished work of art. But when you read it in a theater class, that is the blueprint for what you intend a work of art to be.
Right.
And it makes for a very different analysis. And the most important thing for students is to understand the idea of theme, and that many plays are multi-thematic. But in order to have a clear and concise production that people understand, you kind of need to decide where you're going with the piece. And you have to narrow down the meaning of the play itself into a message or a theme that you as an artist want to communicate to your audience.
Right.
And that's kind of where I come from.
Yeah.
So it makes it a very difficult, that's the hardest thing.
Yeah. Yeah. In undergrad, we had a professor that basically made us do these projects to get to the soul of the production. What's the soul? What's the spine of the production? And so we did little projects to get to the soul and the spine of the production, and they were performance projects, but they were as long as maybe 5 minutes, maybe 3 minutes or something like that.
Right.
Showing. And then if you did that at a production meeting, maybe everybody would be on board, lighting designer, costume designer, set designer and stuff like that. So I know exactly what you're talking about there. And
some people call it the metaphor, the main metaphor. There's all sorts of different names.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then of course your main metaphor for Doll's House might be different than my main metaphor for Doll's House and the students, so it may change as far as where they're going to concentrate. And that's what my group has been discussing as we've been doing this.
Right.
Now,
go
ahead.
I just wanted to backtrack just for a second.
Sure.
My entry into theater was from a senior pro seminar that I took my senior year at Berkeley. that I did not do well in, and it really made me upset that I didn't do well in it. And I didn't research the paper right, but it was an O'Neill seminar. So I read, actually in college, I read every play O'Neill wrote. And that led me, when I was a graduate student, to look at Strindberg and Ibsen a little bit more closely.
Okay.
Strindberg, because he was O'Neill's idol, and Ibsen because the men thought that they hated each other, even though they never met.
Yeah.
And they were kind of an antithetical dramaturgy, but as they moved forward, they kind of they almost met in terms of realism and expressionism that they both had.
Right.
And so A Doll's House is in that early stage. It's Ibsen's second major phase of realism.
Right.
And then that's really what invented modernism, if in the sense that the whole world stopped breathing for a moment and looked at the play and said, oh no, that's not right.
Right.
And that's what began the modern movement.
Right. Right.
For me, go ahead.
So
what I was going to say, for me, modern.
Yeah, go ahead.
For me, modernism is a movement in all sorts of disciplines, is following the Enlightenment and then the Romantic period, in which people began to say all of the ideas we've had since the beginning of time, all these traditions, they're not right. Something's going on. And Ibsen was the messenger of that, because that idea had been going on for a couple hundred years.
Right. Well, and so give me the major players for those who do not know about modern drama as far as playwrights were concerned.
Well, for me, the first one was Ibsen. There are earlier modern plays, but they're kind of scattered around. When Ibsen started writing, people started writing like him, because his plays were based on a well-made play, which was that, and melodrama in the 17 and the 1800s were the main focus of theater, and they were the most popular theater in the history of the world.
Right.
More people went to see melodramas and well-made plays. It would be like you'd go to Broadway to see a comedy, but most people are familiar with TV sitcoms.
Right.
And that's kind of what the melodrama and the well-made play were for people. They were pure entertainment.
Yep.
And they took you on an emotional roller coaster.
Right.
So we have Ibsen, Chekhov developed very separately from him about 25 years later in Russia. He thought he was writing comedies about the upper classes who no longer had any power in Russia.
Right.
But his producing partner, Stanislavski, didn't agree. He thought that they were huge tragedies.
Right.
And the blending of those two ideas really worked well for Chekhov. Unfortunately, he died after writing 5 full-length plays that are all excellent.
Yeah.
Strindberg can be seen as a splinter to Ibsen. He was a bit younger, so he always had Ibsen in mind. But he started in kind of the naturalist phase, and after a few years moved to expressionism, which was for him something very different than like what formal expressionism is. And we don't have to go into that, but his later ideas were about plays being a communication with the subconscious. And for him, the protagonist was always the viewer, and the viewer was supposed to take very personally what happened in the story, in the play, although it really wasn't told in stories.
Right.
It's not realism.
Right.
And so, and he was very personal too. He was very, very autobiographical.
Okay.
And Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, started as a critic. He didn't start playwriting, I think, until he was in his 40s or 50s. Fortunately, he lived to be 90. But he was as a critic, he was one of the main champions of Ibsen. He wrote a huge, I'm not going to be able to say it, a huge article called "The Quintessence of Ibsenism." I think I got it.
Good, good.
And he saw Ibsen as a feminist.
Right.
So that's kind of where that got started.
Right.
Who else we could go? So for me, Ibsen began one school of modernism, which was realism, and there were others who did non-realism, who did shows. Lune Poe was one of the producers that did plays that were more psychological, more surreal. We'd call it surrealistic at this point.
Right.
They didn't at that point. Impressionistic, maybe.
Right.
And there were lots of different kinds of plays that led up to that. My favorite has always been Ubu
Right.
Which is kind of a spoof on Hamlet and Macbeth by Alfred Jarry. I didn't think the name was going to come to me in time. Who wrote it as a 16-year-old rogue, 16-year-old kid in high school. The first time it was produced, there was fighting in the audience. People hated it. Ubu Roy is a gross, horrible person, and the first word in the entire play is shit. Right. Shit, shit, shit. He comes in saying,
right.
And that's what started the fight.
Right.
So we have these kind of two opposing schools, realism and non-realism. Ibsen moved from realism at the beginning into non-realism when he wrote his later plays, and he had already written kind of fairy tale plays based on Norwegian folklore.
Right.
Because as one of your other guests that I was watching said that a lot of modernism, one of the tenets of modernism is that you look at your own culture and society and draw on that for literary ideas.
Right.
And he began doing that with Peer Gynt, which is one of my favorite plays. I don't know, I've never seen it on stage, but
yeah,
it's one of my favorite plays anyway.
It's huge.
Am I missing anybody?
Well, would you throw Oscar Wilde in there at all, or?
He was later. I definitely would throw him in there, but I think he was the most. He would jump into that very reluctantly, into that definition of himself.
Okay.
Because he wrote comedies of manners. He was a member of the Art for Art's Sake Society, which meant his plays weren't supposed to mean anything except to entertain people. And he tried to do it that way, but he couldn't help injecting things from his personal life. And the major thing in his personal life was that he was homosexual.
Right.
And so we get the term bun-bearing in what's his play? Importance of being earnest.
Yeah.
That's an excuse to go out and do something that you're not supposed to do. It was also a term in England at the time, at the turn of the century, a gay term saying that you're going to go meet a stranger for sex.
Right.
One of my students explained that to me.
That's what you rely on. How about Lorca and Pirandello?
Boy, now both of them are a bit later. They're in the 30s.
Okay.
I don't know. Is Lorca in the 30s?
I thought he was a little earlier.
A lot. And they are, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, in the 20s? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot about Lorca, but he certainly is a modernist.
Right. Because I was thinking when you were talking about Strindberg, this is where we're getting, especially Pirandello, going more into the sort of the experimental, but again, more surreal, 6 characters in search of an author, is crafting a play within a play, and sort of like that was the novelty to it. So I don't know if they cared. I mean, that word novelty I always bring up, and I might be wrong in bringing it up, but do you think that that's part of things, such as, I mean, it's a novelty to write A Doll's House because of feminism, or is it just the play that he wrote? And I also want you to branch into, if you could, the history of that story. We were talking,
Okay.
yeah,
So all of his plays were just plays that he wrote.
right,
I mean,
okay,
that's the way it is. People
yeah,
don't write masterpieces, they write plays and they turn into masterpieces based on how the
right,
audience reacts.
right,
Um, he had directed and produced over 100 plays prior to becoming famous as a playwright.
right,
In fact, the reason he left Norway, he first tried to kind of recharge his batteries by going to Copenhagen, and he actually met Hans Christian Andersen, who was the grandfather of the modernist movement in Scandinavia, because he wrote down the plays that had been oral at that time,
right,
turned them into stories, and he actually worked for the Copenhagen National Theater, putting those stories on stage.
right,
And so he was a very old man when Ibsen met him, but that was like one of the highlights of Ibsen's life. And later he asked for um, a pension so that he could go out of the country and write. And Strindberg did the same thing. So to me, I'm not sure how it all works in terms of the culture and in that society. Um, but I think there's something about living outside of your community and reacting to your experiences in that community without fear of reprisal that led him to write these very, very remarkable and very, very controversial plays.
hmm,
I mean, Ghosts was horrible. I mean, people hate a play about inherited venereal disease, which
right,
was not medically true. I
right,
don't think Ibsen knew it wasn't medically true, but he also uses that as a minor theme or a minor occurrence in in A Doll's House with Dr. Rank. Not
right,
only is his name kind of suggests that he is somehow dissolving, but he actually has a form of syphilis that he got from his father,
right,
and therefore he has to be a bachelor for the rest of his life. And
right,
he's in love with Nora.
right,
And I've never figured out why he's in there,
mm,
except to give some humanity to Torvald.
yep.
Um, and there was another major thing you wanted me to talk about that I should have gone to first
Well,
before we.
if we could stick with the Doll's House, when you had said to me over the phone, he did know somebody that he based the Doll's House on. Uh,
Okay, then. Right.
so tell us that story.
Okay. Well, he became very, very famous with Peer Gynt, which was not intended to be put on stage,
Right,
and I don't think they ever did. But he had done kind of historical and mythological dramas. He did,
right,
and the other one he did that was meant to be read was Brand. That was kind of the opposite of Peer Gynt. Brand was a zealot Christian and demanded that his congregations follow him and suffer for it, and his wife and children had to suffer even more. Um, and it's his life of not being of having no flexibility, being so convinced that of his own truth that he imposes it on everyone else, um, and so he dies.
hmm,
I'm not gonna spoil that for you if you ever see it, but
okay,
it's not a human that kills him. Um, but so, like I had said, Ibsen met his wife, and it's not Harriet. I can't remember her name. Had met his wife at one of his wife's mother's salons. She did salons. She was a feminist, and she
right,
was very, very active. She was a leading feminist of the time. So by the time he wrote A Doll's House, I think feminism was more ingrained in him. And I think he saw the world from a more feminist point of view and saw society as being a constraint for women and their potential. And I think that's where he kind of got the idea for A Doll's House. He wrote a play from, as far as he could tell, a woman's point of view, but it wasn't about her plight, it was about everything.
right,
And so his wife had a friend named Laura Keeler, who came to him with a novel she had written, and she had wanted to get it published right away, and she wanted Ibsen to recommend it to her publisher. Well, he read it, and he met with her and said he didn't think it was worthy of publication at this point. And she confided in him that she needed to get money because she had taken out a loan to save her husband's life.
Okay.
And if her husband found out, he would be angry, whatever ramifications there were at that time. She didn't want him to know, but he still refused to do it. And it was through that refusal. Well, if she wasn't a good writer, I'm not going to blame Ibsen for that, but she was found out, and she was kind of dragged through the dirt by her husband, who also had her committed, because any woman who would take out a loan without her husband's permission had to be crazy. So her commitment to an insane asylum was really kind of like the Francis Farmer story, where the poor wife has no say in the matter.
Right.
If you're familiar with Strindberg's The Father, it's a similar situation, except in The Father it gets turned around,
Right.
and the husband going to go to an insane asylum. Anyway, so he was aware of all the events happening, and he based this play on her. That made the husband even more angry. And eventually she left him and began writing, and made a very bad living writing things. And she came to him again with a play later in his career, wanting him to endorse it, and he wouldn't do it again. And so she didn't have a very happy life. As you projected in the interview I saw, that Nora probably would not have had a very happy life. And that's what makes her so courageous. She
Right.
learned from Christine what a life alone for a woman is like. And
Right.
and she embraced it to become
Right.
a better person.
Right.
Um,
That's interesting. Now, so would you say that Ibsen had a role in? Do you think he felt at all guilty about his role in that whole debacle and wrote the play, or it was just an interesting subject for him?
no, I think his relationship with Laura Keebler led him to see some things in society that he hadn't realized.
Okay.
And it was probably stuff that his wife and his mother-in-law had already told him, but he didn't have
Right.
a female perspective to kind of integrate that into his leading. It's similar to we've been told for hundreds of years by African American community
Yeah.
what their gripes are, but we never really heard them because we thought everybody saw the world in the same way.
Right.
Um,
You know,
and so Ibsen, in that way, Ibsen really broke down.
what's interesting is that I've been watching Law and Order UK, which is a little bit more has a little bit more gusto to it, a little bit more plot to it, from the UK. And I know it's the same producer and everything like that, but it's interesting because all these subjects are brought up, and you're watching these subjects being debated in a courtroom atmosphere. And so you're like, I mean, I'm coming up with all these scenarios of plays I could write, or little one-act plays or something like that, just on the subjects that they're talking about and the reactions from the people that are being prosecuted, and as like prosecuted / persecuted, so that's bringing out all this
Right.
drama in there. So I feel that way, and I'm just watching from afar. Ibsen was involved in this whole story, and so it must have a visceral reaction, to that story.
Yes. I don't know though if he felt guilt. I don't know emotionally how he reacted
Yeah, we don't know.
to the occurrences as they happen. And I wish I did, because I love Ibsen to be a good guy.
Right.
But I think he did the woman harm. I don't think he intended to do the woman harm. I think he was being honest with her.
Right.
But certainly given her situation, writing a bad, sending a bad novel to the publisher so that he can work with her and make it work.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem to be such a horrible thing, but that's a different life.
Yeah. Now,
the other thing I find interesting about, oh, go ahead.
No,
Go ahead.
I was going to say,
because I was going to veer off.
Okay, but yeah, let's stick with just a doll's house for a sec. What in your research did you find, if at all, anything about that first, or let's say that first week of performances of A Doll's House? What was the reaction? Because I hear from different scholars different things. What did you remember anything from those first reactions?
I remember it made him a lot of money.
It did. Okay.
Because the book, the biography that I based most of my research on, just to find out kind of basically who he was, they kept careful track of how much money he was making because his wife kept such good records.
Okay.
And it did make a lot of money. At the same time, he was vilified,
Right.
but he wasn't living in the country at the time.
Right.
So that really didn't affect him. And and back in those days, you would write the play, you would sell the play you would, publish the play
Right.
for readers, and then you would produce it.
Right.
It's kind of backwards from the way it is today.
Right.
And so it sold very well. I don't think he ever lost money on a play. Some of them didn't do as well as others. And some of them people just hated. And then there was a faction in every culture in Europe, every different country, that embraced Ibsen. And he was probably the first modernist to be portrayed, to have a play produced in many. A Doll's House was the first modernist play to be produced in many countries. Germany made him change the ending of his play to make to make her come back. It's a 2-page change. At the end, they have their fight, she leaves, and then she comes back and says, we can work it out. And he did that under duress, but the Germans weren't the original producers, and they could produce, and there were no copyright laws, and so they could do it any way they wanted. They wanted to do it the right way, and have the author do it. Luckily, that one hasn't caught on.
Right. What was the main basis of the vilification? What did they vilify him
of the play?
Yeah.
Well, follow me if you will.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I ask students about A Doll's House, the first thing they say is that Torvald is a monster.
Right. Right.
And Torvald is not a monster.
No.
Torvald is the epitome of the rising middle class gentleman, and the way he runs his family and treats his wife.
Yep.
This is like the platonic.
Yep.
Yes, he is the perfect husband. He's providing, and he refuses. He's very careful so that his family will always have money. He won't let anybody sully his name. He was a politician, and so the first thing you have to understand to read it from the context of when it was written is that he was the good guy.
Right.
He was the person who you followed and said, yeah. And it followed a typical well-made play in which each scene ended in a climax, and that climax would grow with each scene till about the middle of the play and then fall for the rest of the play to the resolution. And a well-made play, there was always a happy ending. So, and it took place within 24 hours. So it was a very short time span for the play. And so they got to their happy ending. Torvald had forgiven her. And up to this point, no one had seen Torvald really do anything wrong. People, I believe, agreed with him when he said, we will no longer be actually married. You'll live here in a different bedroom for right. For the sake of the kids.
Right.
He took charge.
Yep.
He then he was vilified. Then, of Krogstad, who was a horrible person. It turned out that he was just in puppy love and had never fallen out of love with Christina.
Right.
Sorry for the spoiler. In all his newfound generosity,
Right.
he wouldn't press charges, and he would forgive the last couple payments of the loan. Which is kind of romantic in that idea,
Yeah.
that it's kind of this, it's when something good happens to a bad person, it changes that person to a good person, which is a real romantic idea.
Which makes a
And
dynamic
so,
character, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So Ibsen could have left the play as it was with their reconciliation and people would have loved it, but he didn't. He added on about a 3 or 4 page epilogue in which Nora tells Torvald that it's not his fault, but she doesn't understand what her place is in society. And she can't trust him, just like she couldn't trust her father, to tell her what society was really like and how to negotiate between her role as a wife and basically the property of her husband and who she is as a fully developed human being, which is what she felt she didn't have. And he does give us clues, that she feels this way.
Right. And that's what we've been exploring, that from beat to beat to beat to beat, especially for Gloria playing Nora. Now I wanted, so I look at this play in a science experiment type of way, where you have the variable and the constant. So the constant is your script, your play, which I know has different interpretations to it, and we all know that. And then you can kind of tweak it if you want to, but it basically has the same story, basically the same lines. And then through the ages, we're talking about maybe only almost 200 years, it's going to mean something different. For example, when I went to undergrad, we had a class of modern drama, and I went to undergrad, and both the males and the female, this is the 1980s, both the males and the females had the same visceral reaction to what your students were doing. And it was both male and female, and they were like, Torvald is an asshole. How could he call her his little, songbird and all of that? He is just, he's got, he is so, chauvinism was very looked down upon when I went to college. If you were accused of being a male chauvinist, you first of all, you couldn't date anybody. Your social life was basically done. And I'm talking male and female. And so that was their visceral response. So I kind of listened to everybody around me going, yeah, maybe they are right, that type of thing. And then you read it, I directed it about 20 years ago. It was a different idea. And then there was a different idea. And so, as you're going through, you've got your control, and then the variables are the times that you're putting it on. But as we've been going through this, we have been seeing exactly what you said. How is a Victorian, rising middle class father figure, husband figure supposed to act? And so my question to you is, when there was vilification, was it both sexes? Was it across the board?
I'm not sure, because women weren't allowed to have a voice. So the mainstream media, if you want to call it that, the press, loved it because it was such a surprise ending. But loved the ending, but they didn't like what it was teaching, and they talked about it being bad for civilization. And so I think one of the main problems in putting it on today is that everybody knows the ending. And so you can't have a well-made play with the surprise ending unless everybody has such admiration for Torvald to be the one of them who went into this upper class job
Yep.
Rank has to be very, very, it has to be very, very, he goes there to kind of worship at Torvald's feet, or so we think.
Yeah.
Torvald magnanimously hires Christine, which he doesn't have to do, but we can't overemphasize the arrogance that we see him today. We have to downplay the arrogance. We have to play against our own best instincts in order to create the society, a world of the play in which we can feel the same shock.
I mean, if you hate Torvald from if you hate Torvald from the beginning, where are you going to go? You got to have, what I'm saying?
Right. It doesn't take you anywhere. Yeah. Well, I got into a discussion with a colleague of mine when I first taught it about 15 years ago, and he was old school. He was also a U of O graduate, but he was very old school. And so he said, this is a play about a woman who took out a loan. The man comes in and calls the loan unless she gets him a job. And then she tries to avoid it. And in the end, she's forgiven by her husband. And then there's this epilogue. And that's the first time I understood it from a traditional point of view.
Right.
From my point of view, the kind of inciting incident, climax, and crisis would go the first time we realize that she has any gumption herself is when she starts eating the cookies.
Right.
And that becomes a very, very big thing when Christine comes and she offers her a cookie, and then Torvald accuses her in front of Christine. That becomes a very big thing. But the fact is that her husband told her not to do something and she does it anyway.
Right.
So she has this independent streak about her.
Right.
The other key scene would be the Tarantella Dance.
Right.
Which Torvald is having her dance for him.
Yep.
To show her off, to show her beauty. Yep. It has to be, the gypsy dress has to be in keeping, but it needs to be risque for that time period.
Sure.
But what I think happens during that scene is she begins to dance for Torvald, and by the end of the dance itself, she's dancing for herself.
Right.
With Torvald yelling at her to stop.
Yep.
And I think that's the critical point in which her attitude changes.
Yep.
There's still the fear, but her attitude changes because it's not Torvald's reaction that disturbs her. It's his turnaround when he discovers that nobody's going to find out.
Right.
I think that is what forces her to leave.
Yep.
And so that incorporates that epilogue, because then the final point of the play is when she leaves. So it's all about this journey from being a little bit rambunctious and a little bit revolting against her husband's petty tyranny, to actually starting to do something for herself, to insisting that she needs to go find herself.
Right.
And I think that plot works a little bit better than the traditional plot for our folk. I've never done it. I've never seen it I've seen the play on stage, but everything in my mind is theoretical.
We're playing.
So there's a mixture in there.
Yeah, we're playing on the identity crisis of Nora, throughout the whole thing, and just,
and that's what it needs to be.
Yeah. Now the other thing about it, a lot of people first of all, we are going to have a production of it in September. I am not casting children. There are children in the play. It's supposed to be Christmas time. Okay.
Right.
So that will happen. There'll be a tree or something like that. But I am going to do voices from off stage probably for the children. So again, with that control and variable, we've got the play that's been written for 150, 200 years. And now we have the millennium, which is a lot of the millennium happened to my son is helicopter parenting, which is,
right.
You know what I'm saying? Is like, you better watch your kids at all times. You better watch your kids. Because something's going to happen. So this woman is leaving her children. And that's something that I don't want to say concentrate on, but I may bring up in the voices off stage, perhaps towards the end of the play. I don't know. We're going to explore that together. But I would say that if you have basically a mother or several mothers or even parents in an audience, that'll be their visceral reaction. You know what I'm saying? What's going to happen with the kids? How can she leave the kids? And I think that might have been back then as well, you know?
Yes, I think you're right. And I just didn't even think about it while we were talking, but I think you're absolutely right that one of the big deals was a mother would never leave her kids under any circumstances. And they address that.
Right.
That and we see it in the first scene, like you were saying, we see her that she plays games with her kids, and there's a nanny.
There's a nanny. Yep.
So yeah.
And what Torvald says to her during the epilogue, I'm sorry, not the epilogue, sorry. The final explosion is, I can't let you raise these kids. I can't let you raise these kids. So he's adding to that problem as well, you know?
Right.
So that there's that. These days we're always looking for someone to blame. Who's the antagonist? Who's the hero? You know, and so I want the big question mark over people's heads when they leave. And I want them to go, I don't know.
I think, yeah, I think that's important because Ibsen doesn't talk about it a lot, and he had kids.
Right.
I don't know how. He was home all the time. Well, when he was a theater practitioner, he wasn't, but later on when they were traveling, he was home all the time. He did his work from home.
Right.
Like and by the way, I share you. I want to go see the statue of Ibsen in is it in Bergen that there's a statue of Ibsen where he lived? Yes. Apparently, when he walked in every day for lunch, the entire restaurant would give him a standing ovation.
That's great.
And I don't know, I don't know if that's true, but I don't know if that was like a Trumpian thing or not either, if he encouraged it or not.
Yeah. And that, back to the money that he made off of A Doll's House. What they were saying was, what an ending. But these days, I think we call it, the shock value. That's where the money's coming in. You got to see this play.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you the ending of it, but you got to see it.
Right.
Money gets exchanged over and over again. And it's like the movie. You got to see this movie. I'm not going to tell you what it's about, that type of thing. And I think it's interesting as that was. Go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying that was.
I think
that was the monetary thing about it. And
right.
But I don't think he wanted, again, we go back to that horrible word novelty. He wasn't doing that. He was writing a play about something that he saw, or sprung off of that.
Well, I do think he believed that society needed to be changed. And I think that's what the whole modernist movement is about. Theater up to that point, up until about 1870s, always maintained the status quo. It supported the status quo.
Right.
In France, by law, it had to support the status quo.
Right.
And in most countries, in order to play Ibsen, and this was true of even England, in order to play Ibsen, you couldn't sell tickets because it couldn't pass the censors. You had to have a theater club in which people joined your theater club for a fee and then got to see the plays for free.
Right.
And that's the only way that he became an international star.
That's interesting. And gives me such great ideas right now for my own personal gain. I'm kidding. So let's just talk briefly about the pandemic. How did that affect you as far as teaching is concerned, or whatever you were doing at the time? I know you were teaching or whatever, research or anything like that. And how do you think it affected theater? We did at the playhouse I used to run, Steve and I did something called Keep the Ghost Light On, which talked to people that were in the
Yes.
professional theater business. And so they had all these different scenarios. The scenarios were different, but they all were like, I'm staying, we're going to do this. It's always been hard. So this is just
Yeah.
one more thing, that type of thing. And I, we thought we were going to have some people weeping over this, and they were all very positive. They were all very, there was about 75 people that we interviewed. So so we got some info on that, and that's most of that was the East Coast. But what's interesting, there was a story about a guy who worked for Disney sound and orchestration, and he has a studio in his house. He said, I don't have to go on the LA freeway for probably about a year and a half. I'm loving it. Because he's working out of his
I was
house.
lucky too.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about
that. Well, I teach history and literature.
Right.
And I've taught online. I've taught that online before at graduate level. So it was really easy for me to take my lectures and my PowerPoints and to do it from home.
Right.
It wasn't as good. It wasn't as much fun. And for me personally, it's harder to communicate for me if I'm not face to face.
Right.
Because I teach I teach one class that's 60 students and one class that can reach up to 90 students, and we have discussions in the class.
Wow.
So it's kind of a balancing act all the time, and it's a lot harder on Zoom because it takes so much longer, and so we get through less stuff. Our costume people, our costume faculty teaching technology, not design, she would buy all the kids' materials and put them outside the theater for them to come pick up. Wow. And then teach them on Zoom. And she had already been experimenting with the upside down classroom, where the lectures are on, you see from home on Moodle, which is our Blackboard or whatever kind of device. And then in class, you're working with them on the work that's inspired by the lecture.
Right.
So for all of us, it was a lot of work, because last spring, not this last spring, but a year ago spring, we had about 2 weeks to move from, we had about 2 weeks notice before we realized that, before the school canceled classes, face-to-face classes, we moved to Zoom.
Right.
So I had it easier than a lot of people. Many of my colleagues, though, had already really used technology to its fullest.
Right.
I think the acting classes had the most difficulty.
Right.
I think that hopefully everyone realized that the students learn less from a platform like that, especially undergrad students. When I was teaching graduate students online, I did it once a year. I would let undergraduates come in under undergraduate number and take the class. And I only had about 4 students do it, but none of them passed the class, simply because it was the first class they dropped. When they didn't have time to do all their work after they are done partying, if that was what the problem was. Or with our students, more likely, because they each hold 2 or 3 jobs. It was the class that they didn't have to get to, because no one was telling them they had to turn this in. It wasn't a presentation in class. They didn't have to have the plays read, so a lot of them waited till the last minute and just couldn't do it.
Did you find that?
Shame.
Yeah. Did you find that your students?
Well, really.
Go ahead.
Well, our entire school, and I think it worked really well. We simply were honest with the students, said, we want you to learn as much as you do in a regular class. You're paying the same amount of money.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to work a little bit harder. You're going to have to participate a little bit more. And some did and some didn't. But all of the students were very forgiving of blips in technology, in problems with scheduling stuff that wasn't quite right. They were very, very forgiving.
Okay. Good.
Students are the great, students are always our greatest generation
Yeah.
every time they come out.
The resilience. Yeah. Um, so I know we talked a little bit about this, but let's wrap up, if it's okay. Let's wrap up with Ibsen himself. Is he more appreciated today, or can be more appreciated today by today's audience, or less, or the same? And does the Me Too movement have anything to do with it? Or should we care about the movements that are going on? And should we, think about that when we're producing these things?
Um, I think Ibsen is still viable today, but I think a lot of what he was calling for all of society to do, we've surpassed that as a society, especially when it comes to women's issues.
Right.
We just a couple of years ago, we did a wonderful production of Hedda Gabler.
Right.
And it was uncut. It was in a small space, in the round, and it was phenomenal. I mean, when that gunshot goes off, it's just as shocking, even though you know what's going to happen.
Yep.
I think other plays, I think a Master Builder would be an excellent play to do today.
Yeah.
Because you have a pathetic man in his older years trying to hang on to his youth and what he wanted to do. And the antagonist to him is a young girl that he had seen when he was very young. And it's almost as if she's not real. She feeds him memories, and you never really know as an audience member if they're true or not, or if this is his flirtation with a young girl trying to stay young, which was a problem that Ibsen had.
Right.
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 I don't know if he consummated any of the relationships out of marriage that he had with 17 and 18-year-old girls when he was in his 60s, I think.
Wow.
But they meant a lot to him.
Right.
I just don't think they were sexual. But it was still love. It was still that he yearned for this kind of youth again.
Right.
Right. He had always seen Strindberg as this man coming up behind him to overtake him. In a lot of ways, Strindberg sort of did, although he's not as viable today he's not done as much today as Ibsen.
Yeah,
but they're very different playwrights.
Yeah, the Ibsen, the story about the 18-year-olds reminds me of Lewis Carroll. Everybody is saying that he is, lecherous and stuff like that. And I think he just wanted his youth,
One that he did drugs.
There you got that too.
Yeah.
So how about Wild Duck?
Wild Duck is such a strange play. It's taken me until I was in my 50s before I figured out what it was about, really.
Okay. So that may confuse people.
I don't know. I think if somebody has a clear picture of what it's trying to say, and it's almost the opposite of his typical message. What's the play in which he said the majority is never right? That was the play in which the town had just had this new spa, and the doctor was going to save the town because there was a bacteria in it.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what it's called. Enemy of the People. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I think that's still a very viable play.
Right.
Because I think it's still true. There was a cancel culture going on, and really what it was is what's going on today is that there's greed. And if who you are and your your imperative toward truth and helping your fellow man is in the way of money wins.
Right.
And if you have the money, you can convince everybody else that it's in their best interest to agree with you. Yeah. And I think that's as true today as it's ever been.
Sounds familiar.
I did see an updated version of that, but I don't think it improved it.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think his plays are very vital. I think that we as artists get caught in the trap of because it's the classic, we don't think enough about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think it's as true today as it was before, that um, um, Shaw, as a critic, hated Shakespeare. He was anti-Shakespeare.
Yep.
Um, and he didn't think Shakespeare was a bad playwright. He just thought that he was no longer relevant to their time, and
Right.
that theater should be socially conscious.
Right.
And we've kind of come to accept that.
Right.
I've had students ask me several times, aren't there any conservative playwrights? And my stock answer is, yeah, David Mamet, go read him. It's all
Yep.
about, he seems to, love greed. I think he's a great playwright.
Yeah.
And a terrible acting teacher.
Right.
So,
but
I think Ibsen is very viable today.
Yeah. And just I mean, we on the virtual end of these things, we started in May, and we're having so many table reads and so much dramaturgical talks about this, and they're just loving it. I've got a mixture of amateur actors and professional actors, and they're just loving this because they never get to do it. They never get to have this much meat on their plate to carve through, so that's why speaking to you is very important.
To me, A Doll's House is beautiful in its construction because there is nothing said in the play that is not relevant later on in the play.
Right.
Even when Christina tells Nora her own troubled life, Nora almost wants to compete with her, and therefore spills the secret about the loan.
Absolutely.
And for me, that's a really important moment. It's showing where she wants to go. The human bent towards self-actualization is there. And I think that's what he was trying to say, is that society was limiting the self-actualization of not only Nora, but of Torvald too.
Right. And I specifically cast Christine and Nora to look like each other, so that they're always.
Yes, I saw that.
I think that'll be interesting.
You cast them a lot younger. You cast them a lot younger than I've ever pictured them in my life, and younger than I've ever seen them in my life.
Yeah.
And I thought it was brilliant.
Thank you.
I looked at I just thought it was brilliant. These are young women.
Yeah, they are.
These are kids who are, and they just hit the jackpot.
Yeah. They delayed the look.
I don't think, I don't think that it could be done in an updated fashion. It could be done in a postmodern fashion. I guess Mabu Mines did the men, just for the audience, the men were no taller than 3 feet, and the women were no shorter than 6 feet.
Right.
So you had the men very, very short, and the set was built for the men.
Yep.
And I haven't seen the whole production, but I think the whole thing is on YouTube.
It is. Maud Mitchell and I, who was in that and produced it, had a conversation about that a long time ago, because we talked about what she was going through with Mabu Mines and the pandemic, and how she's dealing with it. She was very zen about it. She's like, this is the time where you write and you think and you relax, and then you plan. She was great in saying all of that. And then one more thing. We could talk forever, but do you feel that translation is important? As in the choice. Okay.
I think, and I don't know if a playwright has done any translation of this play, but I found my favorite translation has all been playwrights, because otherwise you get, professors of Norwegian who are doing the translating, and they're going for accuracy. And accuracy is not always the best way to go, especially in a realistic play.
Right.
I think
a la David Mamet writing Uncle Vanya, right?
Right. You know, I never read that one. I've never been a Mamet fan. I love the one he did about the college professor and the student.
Oleana. Yeah.
Um,
Well, if you're in,
Oleana, because it can go either way.
right, right. Well, David Mamet wrote a version of Uncle Vanya. It's not that different, but if you never saw this, Uncle Von or Vanya on 42nd Street is that version.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
Louis Malle did the directing of the film, and my dinner with Andre Gregory directed the production. They just keep coming back every year to do Uncle Vanya with Wally Shawn and Julianne Moore and people like that. And so they filmed it. So Louis Malle filmed it, but David Mamet wrote the version, and I directed David Mamet's version of it, and it was fantastic. You know, so
Yeah.
I
No,
hear,
I think he's an insightful man.
yeah. So this,
I just don't happen to agree with his perception of how things work in the world.
yeah, yeah. Well, this has been great, Eric. I really appreciate you coming on. And this is just great stuff. We could go on forever. But and I do wish you all the luck over on the West Coast doing all this great stuff. Um, and please keep in touch. If we have more information, you can take a look at the Bard Room on the Facebook page. And then you know, any other further people that we speak to. But I really appreciate it. By the way, I got you through Marla Chouini. I wanted to thank her because she introduced us, and she was you were her mentor,
Yes.
and she just adores you, and said, you if you can get to talk to Eric, talk to Eric because that will really help you out. And then and I, you know, I might be hitting her up because we might be doing a dramaturgical study of the Crucible, and she's big on Arthur Miller, so that'll be
Hmm.
cool to use her or utilize her stuff on that.
She taught she came out to SOU and taught Arthur Miller class
Right.
for our students, and it was
Awesome.
wonderful.
So thank you,
Yeah.
Eric. Have a great night and a great summer, and thanks for being on the Bard Room. And
Thank you. I enjoyed myself very much.
okay, thank you, and we'll see you guys later, hopefully at another time, and that'll do it.